Hey everybody, this is my favorite coffee, Kona blend coffee. It's 12 ounces. This cost me $5.50 at the store the other day. In 1900, this would have cost me about, if that's 12 ounces, that would have cost me about 12 cents in 1900. In 1800, it would have cost me about 18 to 20 cents. So it now costs me more than 30 times what it cost in 1900 because of inflation, because of the U.S. government's involvement in the money supply. So that's what I'm going to talk about a little bit today, about the greatest robbery in the history of the world with the U.S. government of the takeover of the money supply in 1917, 102 years ago, with the Federal Reserve and getting rid of the FDR, Franklin Roosevelt, getting rid of the national gold standard to the money supply in the 1930s, and then Richard Nixon's eventual elimination of the gold standard internationally in the 1970s. Oh, by the way, Franklin Roosevelt also stole all of Americans' gold from them in the 1930s, but that's a different subject. So, this bag of coffee cost 30 times less in 1900, and you're probably thinking, well, people made a lot less in 1900, and you would be right. They made about, the average salary was about 20 times less than the salary now. Prices were 30 times less than the salary now. So you're probably doing the math and you're like, well, so we're only able to buy about half of what we could buy, half to 60% or whatever of what we could buy, what our ancestors could buy in 1900. That would be right. But it's actually a lot less than that, but I'll get to that in a minute. Let me back up just a little bit. So in 1800, just 3 years after George Washington wasn't the president anymore, bag of coffee, a pound of coffee, 25 cents. In 1900, a pound of coffee, 4 ounces more than this, a pound of coffee, 15 cents. So 25 cents, 1800, 15 cents, 1900. 100 years later, and a pound of coffee cost less. Everything. Bread, milk, eggs, everything costs less 100 years later. Why is that? And the reason for that is because in 19th century America, the market, the free market, capitalism, and the money supply was free, almost completely free. There was virtually no government intervention in the economy. Taxes were only 2 or 3%. That's another subject too. So the government hadn't taken over the money supply, and there was a gold standard. Gold and silver were related to money. So banks were in charge of the money supply. That's right. Free market banks, free people were in charge of the money supply. Industry was almost entirely free, and citizens were almost entirely free, of course, except for blacks and women in the early to middle 1800s. That's a different subject. But the marketplace was free. And what happens in a free marketplace is businesses get more efficient, more economical. Productivity goes up. And this is what happened for 100 years in America, so that the cost to make coffee and bread and get eggs and everything else, wagons and eventually cars, just kept getting lower. The cost got lower for businesses, and because they were competing with each other for people to buy their products, people got their products cheaper too. So everybody now thinks, well, you're supposed to have inflation. No, it was actually deflation. Deflation means that the cost of living goes down. It means things are cheaper for us according to our salary. Inflation means the cost of living goes up, and our money actually becomes less valuable. So for 100 years, money was more valuable. So somebody buying coffee in 1900, and I'll get to this a little bit more in a little bit later, could buy not, compared to me, could buy not one bag of coffee, not 2 bags of coffee, but 3 bags of coffee. That's what their salary, according to the products in the marketplace, was worth. 3 bags of coffee. Their standard of living really was much better than yours and mine because of this giant, massive 102-year robbery of our bank accounts and the money supply. The counterfeiting of money by the government. Counterfeiting isn't done by individuals. Counterfeiting is done by the government. It prints cash in massive amounts, and it's the one that benefits from that. It spends that money first before it gets out into the marketplace, before inflation actually happens. It gets to spend the money before more inflation kicks in. So the money is more valuable to the government, and it just spends it on stuff, gives it away. So with the Federal Reserve taking control of the money supply in 1917, it was able to print tons of cash. As you've probably heard of the Roaring Twenties. The Roaring Twenties was an exuberant expansion of the marketplace by free market capitalism. And it would have been even more exuberant if the government had gotten out of the way. You've probably heard of the Great Depression. Well, the Great Depression happened because the government got in charge of the money supply in 1917 through the Federal Reserve and started printing too much money and started channeling that money into the wrong places in the marketplace, which it's not supposed to do, overinflated everything, and eventually it all, of course, had to collapse. It had to crash. So the 1929 October crash was caused by the U.S. government meddling and thieving and robbing its way into the marketplace. And then, of course, that horrible depression kept going because FDR did a bunch of things that I've mentioned in previous of my programs. But getting back to your salary and my salary, the average salary now. So the reason we can't buy maybe 1.5 bags of coffee now, the reason it's not because our salaries keep going up because of inflation, is because of taxation on top of the government taking charge of the money supply. So back in 1900, all the way up really until 1916, before the government also passed an amendment allowing the U.S. government to tax unequally. So no longer was everybody taxed at the same amount, 2% or 3%, but now it could tax middle-class citizens, upper middle class, and wealthy people much more. And of course that ends up suffocating the marketplace. But what ends up happening is what we have now, and that is the government stealing 39% or 33% or 25% of your money and my money, and then we have fees and licenses and tariffs on top of that, so that effectively about half of our money is stolen from us every year. And most of that is just handed out to losers. So our salaries now, even though the amount of salaries went up 20 times in the last 119 years, but prices went up 30 times, back in 1900, they had almost no money taken out of their paychecks. In fact, no money was taken out of paychecks. That was passed by Franklin Roosevelt also. Money gets taken straight out of your paycheck. So you don't get to say, oh, no, you can't come get my money. So they only lost 2 or 3% of their money back in 1900. Well, now effectively we're losing 50% or almost 50% of our money. So instead of being only half as well off as them salary-wise, we're now about a quarter well off than them salary-wise. So we can only really effectively buy 1 bag of coffee to every 4 bags of their coffee. We can only buy 1 car to their 4 cars back then, or 1 house to their 4 houses. So right now, if those people could sort of get transported in time They could buy the 4 bags of coffee. They could buy 4 cars, or instead of a $30,000 car, they could have a $120,000 car. You and me, too. A $200,000 house, they could have an $800,000 house. That's the way it's supposed to be. Right now, if you have one car that's worth $30,000, you should be able to go out, you would be able to go out and buy a $120,000 car if the government hadn't been stealing hundreds of trillions of dollars from you and me over the last 102 years. There would be mile-high skyscrapers in New York City. They would put all the skyscrapers in the world to shame. The Burj Khalifa, the quarter-mile-high skyscraper in Dubai, that'd be tiddlywinks compared to what America would have. And we would have so many more inventions, so much more technology. Everything would just be greater and bigger and better, and your life and my life would be much wealthier. But the U.S. government has been doing this. This is their little big secret, this little theft that they've been doing. But instead, they look at us as beans. We're not a hill of beans, worth a hill of beans to them. We're worth nothing to them. I mean, imagine handing over your bank account, your neighbor's bank accounts, to a drunk, gambling uncle. You know what would happen to that uncle. Or if you told that uncle, hey, go out and print your own money. Just keep on drinking, keep on gambling. He would just keep on drinking and keep on gambling. That's what our government, our politicians, we've been letting them do for 102 years. And it's got to stop. It's got to stop. And we need to wake up. We need to know. That's what this video is about, is you knowing what I know, that we have to get the government out of the marketplace. We have to get the government out of the monetary supply, the money supply. Get it out of printing money. Abolish the U.S. Mint. Abolish the Federal Reserve. Any kind of relationship between the government and money. Bring back the gold standard, which the banks will do, businesses will do, we will do, or silver standard, or whatever it is. And stop inflation and make it to where we have deflation again, like they did in this great country back in the 1800s, the 19th century. And have more money for us and our family and our friends. So here's to coffee being the price it should be again. Let's get the government out of the marketplace. And let's do it now. Thanks. Take care.